Some debts can never be repaid, but that doesn't stop us from trying. High in the Colorado Rockies, a mountain man named Caleb Stone spends his days caring for a frail old-timer who once saved his life. The old man can barely remember his own name anymore, but Caleb tends to him with quiet devotion, cooking his meals, mending his clothes, and listening to stories that fade like whispers in the wind. For a year, their routine has been simple and peaceful. Then, one bitter February morning, the town mayor arrives at Caleb's remote cabin with armed bodyguards. What he reveals about the old man's past changes everything Caleb thought he knew. What could this forgotten soul have done to bring powerful men with guns to his door? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat at nearly 10,000 feet, where the air was thin and the silence thick enough to wrap around a man's shoulders like a blanket. Caleb Stone had built it himself 7 years ago, choosing this particular spot because you couldn't reach it without wanting to. No accidental visitors, no casual passers-by. Just pine trees that creaked in the wind, granite peaks that scraped the belly of the sky, and snow that fell 6 months out of the year. He stood at the window now, watching dawn break over the eastern ridges. The light came slow at this altitude, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold before surrendering to the flat white of full morning. Behind him, in the room's only bed, the old man slept with the fitful breathing of someone whose dreams were rarely peaceful. Caleb had stopped calling him Thomas months ago, at least in his own mind. The name had been a guess from the beginning, pulled from one of the old man's rare, lucid moments when he'd muttered something that sounded like Tom or Thomas. It seemed to fit well enough. The old-timer never corrected him, though whether that was acceptance or simply because he couldn't remember his own name was impossible to say. What Caleb knew for certain was this. 3 years ago, in the heart of a February blizzard that had nearly been his own end, he'd found the old man half-frozen in a snowdrift 2 miles from the cabin. No horse, no supplies, no explanation for what a man of 70-some years was doing alone in the high country during the worst storm of the decade. Caleb had carried him home, thawed him out, nursed him through pneumonia and frostbite that claimed 3 toes on his left foot. When the old man finally woke, fever-broken and weak as a newborn colt, he'd looked at Caleb with eyes that held more gratitude than words could carry. He'd gripped Caleb's hand and whispered, "You saved my life, son." Caleb had just nodded. He understood something about being saved that went beyond the physical act. Sometimes a man needed to save something outside himself just to prove he wasn't completely lost. The old man never left, partly because by the time spring arrived, he was too weak for the journey down the mountain, partly because neither of them had anywhere else to be. They'd fallen into a routine that felt less like obligation and more like the kind of companionship that doesn't require constant conversation to validate itself. Caleb moved to the stove now, stirring the embers and adding kindling. The fire caught with a whisper, and he set the coffee pot on to boil. While it heated, he mixed cornmeal and water for johnny cakes, working with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd cooked for himself most of his adult life. "Smells good." Caleb turned. The old man was awake, propped on one elbow, watching him with eyes that seemed clearer than usual. These moments of lucidity came and went like mountain weather, impossible to predict, precious while they lasted. "Coffee'll be ready soon," Caleb said. "How'd you sleep?" "Like the dead." The old man chuckled at his own dark humor. Though I suppose I don't know how the dead sleep, do I? Not yet, anyway. You've got years left in you. Maybe. The old man shifted, reaching beneath his pillow for something he kept there always, a leather journal, worn soft as duskin, its pages yellow with age. He clutched it against his chest like a child with a favorite toy. Or maybe I'm just waiting for something. Can't quite remember what. Caleb had seen that journal 1,000 times, but never asked about it. A man was entitled to his privacy, especially a man whose mind was slowly losing its grip on the present. The old-timer also kept a pocket watch that he wound every morning, despite the fact that its hands had frozen in place, permanently stopped at 3:47. The watch was tarnished silver, engraved with initials Caleb had never quite made out, and a date he couldn't read. "Breakfast in 10 minutes, Caleb said, turning back to the stove. They ate in comfortable quiet, the way they usually did. The old man's hand shook when he lifted his coffee cup, but he managed well enough. Afterward, Caleb cleaned up while the old-timer wound his broken watch with reverent care, counting the turns under his breath. "Caleb," the old man said suddenly, his voice carrying that peculiar sharpness that meant his mind had found a clear channel through the fog. "You ever do something you couldn't take back? Something that changed everything?" Caleb paused, dish rag in hand. "I've done a few things I'm not proud of." "That's not what I asked." No, it wasn't. Caleb set down the dish rag and met the old man's gaze. "Yes, I have." The old man nodded slowly. "Me too. Long time ago. Sometimes I can't remember it clear, and sometimes it's all I can remember. Funny how the mind works." "What did you do?" Caleb asked, surprising himself with the question. But the lucidity was already fading. The old man's eyes drifted toward the window, toward something only he could see. "I defended. What was mine?" he said softly. "And I lost everything anyway." Then he was gone again, retreating into whatever distant country his damaged mind preferred to the present. He clutched the journal tighter and began humming something tuneless. Caleb had learned not to push in these moments. He finished cleaning up, then helped the old man into the rocking chair by the window, where he liked to spend his afternoons. Caleb draped a blanket over his lap and set the journal within easy reach. The rest of the morning passed in the usual rhythm. Caleb split firewood, checked his snares, found a rabbit which would make a good stew, and hauled water from the spring that ran year-round about 100 yards downslope. The physical work felt good, felt necessary. It kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering too far down roads he'd come to the mountains to forget. He'd been a soldier once, back when causes seemed clear and orders came with the weight of righteousness behind them. The war between the states had promised glory and delivered nothing but mud and blood, and the screams of boys dying far from home. Caleb had been one of the lucky ones, survived with all his limbs and most of his sanity, but he'd left something essential on those battlefields, some fundamental belief that the world made sense, or that his actions mattered in the grand scheme of things. After the war, he'd drifted. Tried city life and hated the crowds, tried farming and found he couldn't bear to put down roots. Eventually, he'd wandered west, following some instinct he couldn't name, until he'd climbed high enough that the air was too thin for ghosts to follow, or so he'd thought. By afternoon, clouds were building over the western peaks, promising snow by evening. Caleb brought in extra firewood and checked their provisions. They had enough flour, cornmeal, coffee, and dried beans to last another month if they were careful. Salt pork in the cold box, the rabbit from this morning, and a small bag of precious sugar he saved for the old man's coffee. They were isolated up here, but not dangerously so. Caleb made the 2-day journey down to Redemption Falls 3 or 4 times a year for supplies and news. The town had been a modest mining settlement when he'd first arrived, but it had grown in recent years as silver deposits attracted capital and ambition. He had no love for the place. Too many people, too much noise. But it served its purpose. The old man had never asked to go down to town. Never asked about the world beyond this cabin and the surrounding peaks. Whatever had brought him to this mountain in the middle of a blizzard 3 years ago, he seemed content to let it stay buried. As evening settled in and the first snowflakes began to fall, Caleb lit the lamps and started supper. The rabbit stewed with dried onions and wild herbs he'd gathered last summer. The smell filled the small cabin with warmth. The old man was dozing in his chair, the journal open on his lap, his broken watch clutched in one hand. Caleb looked at him with something deeper than affection. This frail, forgetful stranger had given him purpose again, had reminded him that kindness still existed in a world that seemed bent on proving otherwise. Some debts could never be repaid. But tomorrow was another day, and there would be firewood to split and water to haul and meals to cook. There would be the old man's rare moments of clarity and his long stretches of gentle confusion. There would be the mountains standing eternal and indifferent, and the two of them enduring in this high, quiet place. It seemed like enough. It would have to be. The riders came at dawn, when the world was still caught between darkness and light. Caleb heard them before he saw them, the muffled thud of hooves in fresh snow, the jingle of harness brass, the low murmur of men's voices carrying in the thin mountain air. He set down his coffee cup and moved to the window. 5 horses picking their way up the narrow trail that led to his cabin. 4 men in heavy coats and wide-brimmed hats, and one who sat his horse like he owned not just the animal, but the mountain itself. Even from a distance, Caleb could see the glint of rifle barrels and the deliberate way these men moved. This wasn't a social call. The old man was still asleep, his breathing steady and soft. Caleb pulled on his coat, checked that his revolver was loaded, and stepped out onto the porch. He left the door slightly ajar behind him, close enough to hear if the old man woke, far enough to keep whatever was coming outside where it belonged. The riders pulled up 20 feet from the cabin. The lead man dismounted with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to making entrances. He was perhaps 50, well-fed and well-dressed beneath his traveling coat. His face had the smooth, confident look of a man who'd never missed a meal or worried about his next one. "Caleb Stone?" His voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Depends who's asking. "Mayor Clayton Merrick, from Redemption Falls." He gestured to the 4 men still mounted behind him. "These are my associates." Caleb's eyes moved over the associates. Hard men, all of them. Not ranch hands or deputies, the kind you hired when you expected trouble and wanted to make sure you had the upper hand. Each carried a rifle across his saddle, and at least 2 had revolvers on their hips. "Long ride up here, Mayor. Must be important." Merrick smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here on official business. I need to speak with the man you've been harboring." "Harboring?" Caleb kept his voice level. "I'm not harboring anyone. There's an old man here who needed help. I gave it." "The old man?" Merrick took a step closer. "What name does he go by?" "Thomas. Least that's what I call him." "Thomas?" Merrick repeated the name like he was tasting something sour. "And it never occurred to you to wonder who he really was, where he came from. Man's entitled to his privacy. He needed help. I helped him." "Noble." Merrick's smile hardened. "Also illegal, if the man you're helping is a fugitive from justice." Caleb felt something cold settle in his chest. Fugitive? Merrick reached inside his coat. The 4 mounted men tensed, hands drifting toward their weapons, but the mayor pulled out only a folded piece of paper. He held it up, and even from several feet away, Caleb could see it was old, yellowed with age. "This," Merrick said, "is a wanted poster, issued in 1851 for a man named Jackson Ward, wanted for the murder of Samuel Garrett, a prominent landowner in Redemption Falls." He unfolded the paper carefully. The reward was $5,000, still valid according to territorial law. He turned the poster so Caleb could see it. The image was crude, the way they all were, but the face was unmistakable. Younger, stronger, with dark hair instead of white, but the eyes were the same. The set of the jaw, the way the artist had captured something both gentle and stubborn in the expression. It was the old man. It was Thomas. "That's not possible," Caleb said, though his voice lacked conviction even to his own ears. "Oh, it's very possible." Merrick refolded the poster with deliberate care. Jackson Ward murdered Samuel Garrett in cold blood, shot him in his own home, then fled before he could be brought to trial. He's been a fugitive for 34 years, Mr. Stone, and you've been giving him shelter. That old man can barely remember his own name. He's no killer. Time changes us all. Merrick's tone turned almost philosophical. But it doesn't change what we've done. Murder is murder, whether it happened last week or 3 decades ago. Caleb's mind raced. The old man's cryptic words came back to him. "I defended what was mine, and I lost everything anyway." Could it be true? Could this frail, confused old-timer really be a murderer? "I don't believe it," Caleb said, though doubt had already begun its work. "Your belief is irrelevant." Merrick gestured to his men. "I'm taking him back to Redemption Falls to stand trial." Caleb's hand moved to the revolver at his hip. "You're not taking anyone anywhere." The 4 mounted men raised their rifles in one smooth motion. Caleb found himself staring down 4 barrels, his own revolver suddenly feeling very inadequate. Merrick held up a hand, and the rifles lowered slightly. "Let's not be hasty, Mr. Stone. I'm here as a representative of the law. I have every right to apprehend a wanted fugitive." "You're not a lawman, you're a mayor. The distinction is academic in Redemption Falls. I speak for the people, for justice delayed but not forgotten." Merrick's voice took on a practiced quality, as if he'd rehearsed this speech. "Samuel Garrett was my father's partner, a good man, a pillar of the community. His murder nearly destroyed his family. Don't you think they deserve to see justice done?" Behind Caleb, the cabin door creaked. He glanced back to see the old man standing in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, his eyes wide and surprisingly clear. "Jackson Ward," Merrick called out, his voice ringing across the snow, "also known as Thomas. I'm here to bring you to trial for the murder of Samuel Garrett." The old man's face went pale. His hands began to shake, and for a moment Caleb thought he might collapse. But then something changed in his expression, a flicker of recognition, of memory breaking through the fog. "Merrick," the old man whispered, "you're Clayton Merrick's boy." "I am." The mayor's smile was triumphant. "I see you remember." "I remember." The old man's voice grew stronger, though his hand still trembled. "I remember everything about that night." Caleb moved back toward the porch, putting himself between the old man and the riders. "Thomas, don't say anything." "Not without—" "It's Jackson," the old man interrupted. His eyes were locked on Merrick. "My name is Jackson Ward, and I didn't murder Samuel Garrett." "That's for a jury to decide." Merrick remounted his horse. "I'm giving you 24 hours, Mr. Stone, to say your goodbyes, to get his affairs in order, such as they are. But come tomorrow morning, we're taking him down to Redemption Falls. If you interfere, I'll have you arrested as an accessory." 48 hours, Caleb countered. The old man, Jackson, he's not strong. He needs time to prepare for the journey. Merrick considered this, then nodded. 48 hours. But if he's not ready when we return, we'll take him as he is. And if he's fled, if you've helped him flee, I'll hunt you both to the ends of the earth. He pulled his horse around. I'm a patient man, Mr. Stone, but I'm also a determined one. Justice will be served. The riders turned and began their descent down the mountain. Caleb watched until they disappeared around a bend in the trail, swallowed by the trees and the morning mist. He turned to find Jackson. He could no longer think of him as just Thomas, leaning heavily against the door frame. The clarity in his eyes was fading, confusion creeping back in like fog. "They're coming for me," Jackson said softly. "Finally coming for me." "We can run," Caleb said. "I can get you out of here before they come back." But Jackson shook his head. "I've been running for 34 years, son. I'm tired." He touched the journal that he still carried, pressed against his chest beneath the blanket. "Besides, the truth is in here. Always has been." "What truth?" Jackson's eyes focused on Caleb with sudden, piercing intensity. "The watch," he said, "and the journal. They tell the truth. If something happens to me, if I can't remember, or if I'm gone, you read it. You'll understand." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't murder Samuel Garrett. I defended myself. But who believes an old fugitive over a powerful family?" Then the fog rolled back in. Jackson's shoulders sagged, and he looked suddenly lost, like a child who couldn't find his way home. "I'm cold," he said plaintively. "Is there coffee?" Caleb helped him back inside, settled him in his chair by the fire. But as he poured the coffee, his mind was racing. 48 hours, 2 days to discover the truth about a murder that happened before he was born. 2 days to decide whether to protect a possible killer or trust in the word of a man whose mind was slipping away. He looked at the leather journal sitting on the table beside Jackson's chair. The old man clutched his broken pocket watch, winding it with automatic precision, counting the turns under his breath. The watch showed 3:47, frozen at that moment for more than 3 decades. What had happened at 3:47? What had stopped time for Jackson Ward? Caleb picked up the journal, feeling its weight in his hands. He'd never opened it, never violated Jackson's privacy. But privacy seemed a small concern now, weighed against a man's life. "Jackson," he said quietly. "May I read this?" The old man looked up, his expression vague. Then something flickered. Understanding, permission, or maybe just resignation. "Read it," Jackson said. "Read it all. Then you decide if I'm worth saving." Caleb opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was neat, careful, the ink faded but still legible. The date read, April 15th, 1847. He began to read. Redemption Falls had changed since Caleb's last visit. The modest mining settlement he remembered had grown into something approaching a real town. 2-story buildings lining a main street that had been graded and gravelled, sidewalks that kept pedestrians out of the mud, and gaslights that promised civilization had arrived in the high country. Caleb rode in just before sunset on the second day, his horse tired and his body aching from the journey. The storm that had threatened the mountains had mostly passed them by, leaving only scattered snow and bone-deep cold. He found lodging at a boarding house on the edge of town, a tidy establishment with a hand-painted sign that read, "Mrs. Chen's Rooms, Clean Beds, Fair Rates." The proprietor was a small Chinese woman, perhaps 60 years old, with sharp eyes and an air of competent efficiency. $2 for the week, meals included, she said, looking him over. You pay in advance, You keep your room clean, and you don't bring trouble through my door." Caleb paid and was shown to a small but spotless room on the second floor. Mrs. Chen lingered in the doorway as he set down his saddlebags. "You don't look like a miner," she observed. "I'm not. And you don't look like a businessman." "I'm not that either." She studied him a moment longer, then nodded. "Mountain man, then. We don't see many of your kind anymore. Most men these days want to be close to other people, close to money. What brings you down from your solitude?" Caleb hesitated, then decided honesty might serve him better than evasion. "I'm looking into something that happened a long time ago, 1851. Mrs. Chen's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "That's a long time to hold on to the past. Some pasts don't let go easily." She was quiet for a moment, then surprised him by saying, "The town records office opens at 8 tomorrow morning. Mr. Hoskins has been the clerk there for 40 years. If you're looking for history, he's the man to see." She turned to leave, then paused. "But be careful, Mr. Stone. Caleb Stone. Be careful, Mr. Stone. Some people in this town don't like their history examined too closely." With that cryptic warning, she left him alone. Caleb spent the evening walking the streets of Redemption Falls, getting a sense of the place. The prosperity was evident. Well-maintained shops, a bank with marble columns, a hotel that wouldn't have been out of place in Denver. And on the hill overlooking it all, a mansion that could only belong to one man. The Merrick estate. It sat behind wrought-iron fencing, 3 stories of painted wood and glass, with manicured grounds that must have cost a fortune to maintain in this climate. Caleb stood at the gates, looking up at the windows glowing with lamplight, and thought about the hand-drawn map in his saddlebag. This land, these buildings, this entire empire of prosperity, how much of it had been built on what was stolen from Jackson Ward? He returned to the boarding house as full dark fell. Mrs. Chen served dinner in a small dining room, beef stew with vegetables, fresh bread, and coffee strong enough to strip rust. There were 3 other boarders, all miners, who ate quickly and spoke little before retreating to their rooms. Mrs. Chen sat down across from Caleb as he finished his meal. "You're interested in the Ward case," she said. It wasn't a question. Caleb set down his coffee cup. "How did you know?" "Because anyone asking about 1851 in this town is either interested in the silver strike or the Ward case. And you don't look like you care about silver." She poured herself coffee from the pot. "I was here when it happened. Young woman, newly arrived from San Francisco with my first husband. I remember Jackson Ward." Caleb leaned forward. "What do you remember?" "A good man. Quiet, hard-working. He loved his family. You could see it in the way he looked at his wife and daughter. I used to see them in town on Saturdays. Mary Ward would buy fabric at the general store, and Jackson would buy peppermints for Elizabeth. Simple people. Happy people. And Samuel Garrett," Mrs. Chen's expression hardened. "Rich, ambitious, the kind of man who saw everything as something to be owned or conquered. He wanted Jackson's land. Everyone knew it. The spring that ran through Ward's property was the best water source in the valley. The journal says Garrett harassed them, burned their barn, poisoned their cattle. The journal survived?" Mrs. Chen looked surprised. "I didn't know Jackson kept a journal." "He did. Very detailed. He documented everything." She was quiet for a long moment, her coffee growing cold in her hands. There were rumors back then. People said Garrett's men were terrorizing the Wards. But no one did anything. Garrett had money, influence. The sheriff was in his pocket. And then one night in April, Garrett died. Shot in his own home. They said Jackson Ward broke in and murdered him, that Ward fled into the night and was never seen again. She met Caleb's eyes. But there were other rumors, quieter ones. What kind of rumors? That there were more shots than one. That Garrett's ranch hands, 2 men named Sykes and Porter, disappeared the same night. That the whole thing wasn't as simple as the official story made it sound. She lowered her voice. Some people said it was Garrett's men who went to Ward's place first. That what happened at Garrett's estate was Ward fighting back. Did anyone investigate those rumors? Clayton Merrick, the current mayor's father, was Garrett's business partner. He took control of everything after Garrett died. The investigation was brief and conclusive. Jackson Ward murdered Samuel Garrett in cold blood and fled. Ward's property was seized to settle debts. Merrick got the land, the spring, everything. And people just accepted that? Mrs. Chen's smile was sad. Those who didn't accept it either left town or learned to keep quiet. Merrick was even more powerful than Garrett had been. And his son? She shook her head. Clayton Jr. is worse, smoother, more dangerous. He runs this town like his personal kingdom. Caleb absorbed this, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Where can I find the town records tomorrow? Main Street, above the bank. But Mr. Stone... She reached out and touched his hand. Be very careful. If you're trying to prove Jackson Ward was innocent, you're threatening the foundation of the Merrick family's entire fortune. That's not something Clayton Jr. will allow. After she left, Caleb returned to his room and opened the journal again. He read through the entries from March 1851, looking for details, for evidence of anything that could support Jackson's version of events. One entry caught his attention. March 28th, 1851. Garrett sent his lawyer with final offer, $3,000 and guaranteed safe passage to California. I refused. The lawyer said, Mr. Garrett is losing patience. This is your last chance to settle this peacefully. I told him there's nothing peaceful about extortion. The lawyer left, but not before saying, what happens next is on your conscience, Ward. My conscience is clear. I'm defending what's mine. Caleb closed the journal and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow he would visit the records office, would try to find concrete evidence. But already he could feel the weight of what he was doing, challenging a powerful family, digging up a past they'd buried and built their empire on. He thought about Jackson, alone in the cabin, clutching his daughter's doll and his broken watch. Thought about Mary Ward, who'd died of grief, never knowing the truth. Thought about Elizabeth, who'd grown up believing her father was a murderer. Some debts could never be repaid, but maybe some truths could finally be told. He blew out the lamp and tried to sleep, knowing tomorrow would bring him closer to understanding what had really happened on that April night in 1851, and what it might cost to prove it. The town records office occupied a cramped space above the Redemption Falls Bank. Caleb climbed the narrow stairs at 8 sharp and found a small room lined with filing cabinets and shelves sagging under the weight of ledgers and document boxes. Behind a desk cluttered with papers sat a man who could only be Mr. Hoskins. He was perhaps 70, thin as a rail, with spectacles perched on his nose and ink stains on his fingers. He looked up as Caleb entered, his expression politely neutral. Help you with something? I'm looking for records from 1851, Caleb said. Property transfers, court documents, anything related to the Ward and Garrett families. Hoskins's neutrality shifted to something more guarded. He set down his pen carefully. That's specific. May I ask your interest? Personal research. Personal research into a 34-year-old murder case. Hoskins studied him over his spectacles. You're the mountain man who's been taking care of Jackson Ward, aren't you? Word travels fast in a small town, Mr. Stone. Caleb saw no point in denying it. I am. And Mayor Merrick is planning to bring Ward down to stand trial. He is? Hoskins was quiet for a moment, then stood and walked to the window overlooking Main Street. I was the clerk here when it happened. I filed the death certificate for Samuel Garrett. I recorded the property transfer from Ward to Merrick. I witnessed the official account become the accepted history. He turned back to Caleb. I've carried that weight for 34 years. What weight? The weight of knowing the official account wasn't the whole truth. Hoskins moved to one of the filing cabinets and pulled out a box. The records you want are public. You have every right to see them. But I should warn you, they'll raise more questions than they answer. He set the box on the desk and opened it. Inside were yellow documents, carefully organized and labeled. Hoskins pulled out several and spread them before Caleb. Samuel Garrett's death certificate, he said, pointing to the first document. Died April 14th, 1851, from a gunshot wound to the chest. Signed by Dr. Marcus Flynn, witnessed by Clayton Merrick Sr. Caleb scanned the document. It was straightforward, clinical. Then he noticed something. It says the time of death was approximately 3:45 in the morning. It does. Hoskins pulled out another document. And here's the property transfer, dated May Ward, 1851. The Ward homestead transferred to Samuel Garrett's estate in settlement of outstanding debts. He pointed to the signature line, signed by Jackson Ward. Caleb looked at the signature, a shaky X with Jackson Ward written beside it in different handwriting. Ward signed with an X? But I've seen his journal. He was educated. His handwriting was clear and practiced. Interesting observation, Hoskins said quietly. I noticed that too, at the time. You're saying this signature is forged? I'm saying the man who kept journals and wrote letters to suppliers in clear, educated script would not have signed his property away with an X. Hoskins pulled out more documents. Here's the official report from Sheriff Davies. It states that Jackson Ward broke into Samuel Garrett's home on the night of April 14th, shot Garrett during an argument over the land dispute, and fled before law enforcement could apprehend him. Caleb read through the report. It was brief, conclusive, and strangely lacking in detail. It doesn't mention any witnesses, doesn't mention evidence beyond the fact that Garrett was shot and Ward disappeared. No, it doesn't. Hoskins retrieved one more document. This is what I find most interesting. The inventory of Garrett's estate, conducted 2 days after his death. It lists all his property, assets, and holdings. He pointed to a line item. Note what's missing. Caleb scanned the list. Ranch land, cattle, equipment, furnishings, cash holdings. Then he understood. There's no mention of Ward's property, the spring, the eastern meadow. Because technically, Garrett didn't own it yet. He died before the transfer could be completed. Hoskins sat back down. But within 2 weeks, Clayton Merrick Sr. had acquired all of Garrett's holdings, including the claim to Ward's land. The forged signature on that transfer gave him legal cover. Why didn't you say something? Report this to the territorial authorities? Hoskins removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly. I was a young man then, Mr. Stone. I had a wife, a child on the way. Merrick made it very clear that anyone who questioned the official account would find themselves without employment, or worse. I justified my silence by telling myself that Ward had fled, that he was never coming back, that the truth didn't matter anymore. He replaced his spectacles. I've regretted that cowardice every day since. Caleb studied the old clerk with new understanding. You're helping me now, I'm simply providing public records to a citizen with a legitimate inquiry. But Hoskins's slight smile suggested more. Though if you were to say, notice discrepancies in these documents, draw your own conclusions, well, that would be all right. Caleb gathered the documents carefully. Can I get copies of these? Official copies require a fee and 3 days processing time. Hoskins paused meaningfully. However, if someone were to borrow these documents for a few hours to, say, review them more carefully, over lunch, and if those documents were returned by end of business today, I might not notice they'd been gone. Thank you, Caleb said quietly. Don't thank me yet. These documents prove the signature was likely forged, but they don't prove what really happened that night. They don't prove Ward was innocent of murder. What do you think happened? Hoskins was quiet for a long moment. I think there's a reason 2 of Garrett's ranch hands, Sykes and Porter, disappeared the same night Garrett died. I think there's a reason the official report was so brief and lacking in detail. And I think there's a reason Merrick Sr. moved so quickly to acquire everything. He met Caleb's eyes. But thinking something and proving it are different things. Mrs. Chen mentioned there were rumors about Garrett's men going to Ward's place first. There were. My wife heard them from other women in town. Stories about gunshots coming from 2 locations that night, first from the Ward homestead, then later from the Garrett estate. Stories about Garrett's men riding out armed and coming back blooded. But rumors aren't evidence, Mr. Stone, especially not against powerful men who control the sheriff and the courts. Caleb carefully packed the documents into his saddlebag. One more question. The watch that Jackson carries, it stopped at 3:47. Do you know if that's significant? Hoskins's expression grew thoughtful. Garrett died at approximately 3:45, according to the death certificate. If Ward's watch stopped at 3:47, that would be roughly the same time. Might have been damaged in a struggle, or might have been stopped deliberately to mark the moment. He stood. Those documents need to be back before 5. Caleb nodded and headed for the door. As he reached it, Hoskins called out, Mr. Stone, be very careful. You're not just challenging the official record. You're threatening to expose that the Merrick family fortune was built on theft and possibly murder. Clayton Jr. won't let that stand. I know, Caleb said, but an innocent man deserves the truth to be told. Does he? Hoskins's question was sad, resigned. Sometimes the truth just gets good people killed. Caleb left the records office with more questions than answers, but also with something he hadn't had before, evidence that the official story was built on lies. The forged signature, the missing details, the convenient disappearance of witnesses, all of it pointed to a conspiracy. But Hoskins was right. Pointing wasn't proving. And in less than 24 hours, Mayor Merrick would return to the cabin to collect Jackson Ward. Caleb had to find something more, something that would prove beyond doubt what had really happened on that April night in 1851. He walked back toward the boarding house, his mind racing through possibilities, when he saw it. A small photography studio with a faded sign reading, Portraits and Memories, Estienne 1848. And suddenly, he knew where to look next. The photography studio was dim and smelled of chemicals and old paper. Caleb found the proprietor in the back room, an elderly man hunched over a workbench where he was developing plates. Be with you in a moment, the man called without looking up. Caleb waited, studying the photographs that lined the walls. Portraits of families, miners, businessmen. A chronicle of redemption falls captured in shades of sepia and grey. The photographer finally emerged, wiping his hands on a stained apron. He was perhaps 65, with a shock of white hair and eyes that still held the sharpness of someone who'd spent decades looking at the world through a lens. Mr. Stone, isn't it? Mrs. Chen's new boarder. He extended a hand. I'm Thomas Graves. Everyone calls me Graves. What can I do for you? I'm looking for a photograph, Caleb said, from 1850 or 1851, of the Ward family. Graves's expression shifted. That's a name I haven't heard spoken aloud in this town for many years. May I ask why? Caleb decided on honesty. Because Jackson Ward is alive, and Mayor Merrick is planning to hang him for a murder I don't believe he committed. Graves was silent for a long moment, then moved to a cabinet in the corner. I took their portrait in the summer of 1850. Town celebration, Independence Day. Jackson insisted. Said he wanted a picture of his family while they were still happy. He pulled out a folder and carefully removed a photograph mounted on cardboard. He handed it to Caleb. The image showed 3 people posed in front of a simple backdrop. Jackson Ward stood with his hand on his wife's shoulder, a man in his 30s with an honest face and kind eyes. Mary Ward sat in a chair, pretty and gentle-looking, her expression serene. And between them, standing with her mother's arm around her waist, was a girl of perhaps 9 or 10. Elizabeth. She held a wooden doll in her hands. Caleb stared at the photograph. These people who had been so thoroughly erased from history. They looked exactly as he'd imagined them from the journal entries. Decent, ordinary people who'd wanted nothing more than to build a life together. They look happy, Caleb said quietly. They were. You could see the love between them. Graves pointed to Jackson's face. Look at his eyes. That's not the face of a man capable of cold-blooded murder. Can I borrow this? You can keep it. I have the plates. I can make more. Graves returned to the cabinet and pulled out another photograph. But there's something else you should see. This second photograph showed a different group, 3 men standing in front of an impressive building. Caleb recognized one of them immediately from his portrait hanging in the bank. Samuel Garrett, prosperous and confident. Beside him stood an older version of Mayor Clayton Merrick, the current mayor's father, and between them, a third man Caleb didn't recognize. Garrett, Merrick Sr., and that's Sheriff Davies, Graves explained. Taken in 1850. Notice anything interesting? Caleb looked closer. They're standing in front of what looks like the foundation of a building. The foundation of what would become Merrick's mansion. Started construction in late 1850, finished in early 1852. Graves let that sink in. Expensive project, very expensive. More expensive than a failing rancher, and his modestly successful partner should have been able to afford. Unless they were planning to acquire valuable property, Caleb said slowly. Property with a year-round water source. Exactly. Graves pulled out one more item, a newspaper clipping, yellowed and fragile. This ran in the Redemption Falls Gazette in June 1851, 2 months after Garrett's death. Caleb read the headline. Merrick expands holdings, plans major cattle operation. The article detailed how Clayton Merrick Sr. had acquired the late Samuel Garrett's ranch and additional properties, including the valuable Ward homestead with its essential water rights. The article praised Merrick's vision for bringing prosperity to the valley. They had it all planned, Caleb said, anger building in his chest. Before Garrett died, they'd already decided how they would divide up Ward's land. I believe so, but I could never prove it. Graves took the clipping back carefully. Mr. Stone, I was young and ambitious when all this happened. The Gazette was my first real job as a journalist. When Garrett died, and the official story came out, I tried to investigate. I asked questions, interviewed people, looked for inconsistencies. What happened? Merrick bought the newspaper. Within a month, I was out of a job. Within 6 months, I'd opened this photography studio because no other newspaper in the territory would hire me. His voice carried old bitterness. I learned the same lesson Mr. Hoskins learned. You don't challenge powerful men and expect to survive unscathed. Caleb carefully packed the photographs and the clipping. I'm going back to the cabin tonight. I need to read the rest of Jackson's journal, the part about the night Garrett died. There has to be something there. Be careful, Graves warned. Merrick has eyes everywhere. If he knows you're digging into this, he already knows. He came to my cabin himself to arrest Jackson. He knows I won't just hand over an innocent man. Back at the boarding house, Caleb found Mrs. Chen waiting for him in the dining room. She set down a pot of tea and 2 cups. "Sit," she said. "You look like you need this." Caleb sat and accepted the tea gratefully. Mrs. Chen poured for both of them, then reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small photograph in a decorative frame. "I was going to show you this last night, but I wanted to see if you were serious first." She slid the photograph across the table. It was the same family portrait Graves had given him: Jackson, Mary, and Elizabeth Ward. But this copy was in a frame, carefully preserved. "Mary gave this to me a week before she died," Mrs. Chen said softly. She'd heard the rumors about what had happened. She knew Jackson hadn't murdered anyone, knew he'd been defending himself, defending what was theirs. But she also knew no one would believe her. She was just a grieving widow with no proof. "She told you what really happened?" "She told me what she believed happened, based on what she knew of her husband." Mrs. Chen wrapped her hands around her teacup. "She said Jackson would never have gone to Garrett's estate looking for violence. But if Garrett's men had come to their home first, if they'd tried to kill him, then yes, Jackson would have fought back. And if he'd won that fight, he would have run. Not because he was guilty, but because he knew no court would believe a poor homesteader over a rich landowner's estate." "Did she have any proof?" "She had a letter. Jackson had managed to get one letter to her before he disappeared completely. He told her what happened, all of it. She kept that letter until the day she died." Mrs. Chen's eyes grew sad. "I was with her at the end. She made me promise to burn it. Said she couldn't let Elizabeth grow up knowing the truth, because it would put her in danger. If the Merricks thought Elizabeth knew anything, they might." She didn't finish the sentence. "You burned it?" "I did. I've regretted it every day since, but I keep my promises." She leaned forward. "But I remember what it said. Jackson wrote that Garrett's men, Sykes and Porter, came to his house in the middle of the night. They set fire to it while he was inside. He escaped through the root cellar, but everything he owned was burning. He went to Garrett's estate to confront him, to end it once and for all. And he found Garrett in his study. Garrett was drunk, celebrating. He told Jackson that by morning, the sheriff would arrest him for arson and attempted assault on Garrett's men, that Jackson would hang, and Mary and Elizabeth would be left with nothing. Garrett said he'd take care of Mary and Elizabeth personally." Caleb's hands tightened on his teacup. "What happened then?" "Garrett drew a gun. They fought. The gun went off. Garrett died." Mrs. Chen's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "Jackson looked for evidence, something to prove Garrett had orchestrated everything. He found it on Garrett's desk, a letter Garrett had written, but not yet sent to Clayton Merrick Sr. It detailed their entire plan, How to force Ward off his land, how to make it look legal, how to divide the profits. What happened to that letter? Jackson took it. He wrote in his letter to Mary that he had proof, but he couldn't use it. If he came forward, they'd kill him before he ever reached a courtroom. So he ran, and he kept running, and he lived with the guilt of leaving his family even though staying would have meant death. Caleb sat back, his mind reeling. The letter. If it still exists, it's the only proof that could exonerate Jackson Ward. Mrs. Chen met his eyes. Mary's letter said Jackson would keep it with him always, that he'd hidden it somewhere safe, somewhere he could protect it. The journal. Caleb's heart raced. Jackson had said the journal held the truth, not just the entries but something more, something hidden. He stood abruptly. I need to get back to the cabin. Now. It's nearly dark and there's weather moving in, Mrs. Chen warned. I don't have time. Merrick is coming tomorrow at dawn. Caleb gathered his things quickly. Thank you. For everything. Mr. Stone. Caleb. She stood as well. What you're doing, trying to prove an old man's innocence after all these years, it's noble. But it's also dangerous. Merrick won't let you destroy his family's reputation. He won't let the truth come out. Then he should have thought of that before he came to my cabin threatening an innocent man. Caleb rode out of Redemption Falls as the sun set, the photographs and documents secured in his saddlebag. The ride back up the mountain would be treacherous in the dark, but he had no choice. He needed to examine that journal again, needed to search for the letter that could prove everything. The letter written by Samuel Garrett himself, detailing his conspiracy with Clayton Merrick Sr. to steal Jackson Ward's land through intimidation, violence, and ultimately murder. If it existed. If Jackson had truly kept it all these years. If Caleb could find it before the mayor arrived with his guns and his lies and his determination to bury the truth forever. The wind picked up as he climbed higher, and snow began to fall. Caleb pulled his coat tighter and urged his horse forward. Behind him, Redemption Falls disappeared into the darkness, its lights twinkling like false promises. Ahead, somewhere in the mountains, Jackson Ward waited, alone with his broken watch, his daughter's doll, and a secret that had survived 34 years. Caleb just had to find it before time ran out. Caleb reached the cabin well after midnight, his horse exhausted and his own body numb from cold. Snow had fallen steadily during the climb, and the trail had been treacherous in the darkness. But he'd made it. The cabin windows glowed with lamplight. Jackson was awake, sitting in his chair with the journal open on his lap. He looked up as Caleb entered, stamping snow from his boots. "You came back," Jackson said, his voice clearer than Caleb had heard it in days. "I wasn't sure you would." "I said I would." Caleb moved to the stove, warming his hands. "And I found things in town. Important things." He spread the documents and photographs on the table, explaining what Hoskins had shown him, what Mrs. Chen had told him, what Graves had shared. Jackson listened with growing intensity, his eyes moving from the family portrait to the forged property transfer to the newspaper clipping. "Mary kept the portrait," Jackson whispered, touching the photograph with trembling fingers. "All those years, she kept it. She believed in you. Until the day she died." Caleb pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Mrs. Chen said Mary told her about a letter you took from Garrett's desk the night he died. A letter that proved he and Merrick Sr. were conspiring to steal your land." Jackson's eyes widened with recognition and fear. "The letter? Yes. I have it. I've always had it." "Where?" Jackson's hands moved to the journal, and Caleb saw him do something he'd done 1,000 times before, but never understood the significance of. Jackson ran his fingers along the inside of the leather binding, found a seam, and pressed. A hidden pocket opened, so cunningly made that it was invisible unless you knew it was there. From this pocket, Jackson pulled a single piece of paper, folded small and stained dark brown along one edge. Blood. 34-year-old blood, dried to the color of rust. "I made the pocket myself," Jackson said, his voice distant with memory. "The morning after, before I ran. I knew I had to keep it safe, had to protect the only proof of what really happened." He unfolded the paper with infinite care. The handwriting was bold, confident, the handwriting of a man who'd never doubted his own power or authority. Caleb read, "Clayton, the Ward situation has gone on long enough. The man refuses every reasonable offer and shows no sign of yielding. I've tried legal pressure, financial pressure, and the subtle encouragement of his neighbors. Nothing moves him. It's time for more direct measures. Your investment in this venture entitles you to a return, and I intend to deliver. This week, I'm sending Sykes and Porter to Ward's homestead with instructions to end this impasse permanently. The plan is simple. An unfortunate fire, an unfortunate accident. Ward dies, his widow and child inherit, and we present the widow with an offer she cannot refuse in her grief and poverty. If by some chance Ward survives or escapes, we proceed with the alternate plan we discussed. Frame him for assault or arson, use our influence with Davies to ensure conviction, hang him legally. Either way, by spring we'll have that water and the eastern meadow, and your mansion will overlook the most prosperous cattle operation in the territory. The beauty of this approach is its legitimacy. No one questions a widow selling land she cannot maintain. No one questions a convicted criminal's property being seized. We win regardless of how Ward responds. Destroy this letter after reading. Some truths are best left unrecorded. S. Garrett, April 13th, 1851. Caleb read it twice, his hands shaking with controlled anger. This wasn't just evidence of a conspiracy, it was a confession of premeditated murder. Garrett hadn't just wanted Ward's land, he'd been willing to kill for it, had planned it with the cold calculation of a business transaction. "They came that night," Jackson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "April 14th, just after midnight. I heard them outside the house, heard them splashing something. Lamp oil, I realized later. Then the smell of smoke. You escaped through the root cellar." "I did. Watched my home burn from the tree line. Everything Mary and I had built, everything we'd worked for, gone in minutes." Jackson's hands trembled. "I should have run then, should have fled to Denver, to Mary and Elizabeth. But I was so angry, so—" He paused, searching for the word. "Righteous in my fury, I rode to Garrett's estate. You confronted him. I found him in his study, alone, drunk, celebrating. He laughed when he saw me, actually laughed, said I looked like hell. Then he told me his plans, told me that by morning I'd be arrested for arson, that I'd hang, that he'd console Mary personally, help her through her grief before buying the land from her at a fraction of its value." Caleb could picture it, the burning rage, the helplessness, the desperation of a man who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. "He drew a pistol from his desk drawer," Jackson continued, "said he'd finish it himself, save the territory the cost of a trial. We fought. I grabbed his wrist, tried to point the gun away. It went off." Jackson's eyes were distant, seeing that night as clearly as if it were happening now. The bullet hit him in the chest. He fell, and I stood there, watching him die, and all I could think was that I'd just proved him right. I was a murderer now. "It was self-defense," Was it? I went to his home. I confronted him. Yes, he drew first, but I was there looking for violence, looking for confrontation. Jackson shook his head. In the eyes of the law, I doubt the distinction would have mattered. What happened then? I saw the letter on his desk. It was sitting there, unsealed, waiting to be delivered. I read it and understood everything, every piece of harassment, every threat, every act of violence. It had all been calculated, planned. Jackson touched the blood-stained edge of the paper. This is Garrett's blood. I took the letter, and as I picked it up, his blood dripped onto it. I kept it because it was the only proof of the truth. Why didn't you come forward with it? Show it to the territorial authorities? Because Merrick Sr. had already bought the sheriff, the judge, and half the territorial government. You think a letter would have saved me? They'd have called it a forgery, evidence I'd manufactured to cover my crime. And while they were debating its authenticity, I'd have been in a cell, or a grave. Jackson's voice grew firm. I chose to run, to disappear, to let Mary and Elizabeth believe I was dead or a coward rather than put them in danger. Because if Merrick thought they knew anything, if he thought they posed a threat. He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. Caleb understood. Jackson had sacrificed his reputation, his family, his entire life to keep them safe. Mary died, thinking you'd abandoned her, Caleb said gently. I know. Jackson's eyes filled with tears. That's the price I paid, the weight I've carried for 34 years. But Elizabeth lived, grew up safe, even if she grew up believing her father was a monster. That was worth it. Caleb looked at the letter again, at the damning words written in Garrett's own hand. This is proof, real, undeniable proof of conspiracy to commit murder. With this, we can what? Jackson interrupted. Challenge the foundation of the Merrick family's fortune? Expose that their wealth was built on theft and planned murder? You think Clayton Jr. will let that happen? You think he'll allow his family name to be destroyed? What's the alternative? Let him take you down the mountain and hang you for a crime you didn't commit? I'm an old man, Caleb. I've lived longer than I deserved. Maybe it's time to face what I did, regardless of whether it was justified. Caleb stood abruptly. No, I won't accept that. He moved to the window, looking out at the darkness and falling snow. There has to be a way. We have the letter. We have the forged property transfer. We have testimonies from people who remember the truth. Testimonies from people too afraid to speak up for 34 years. A forged signature that could be explained away. A letter that Merrick will claim is fabricated. Jackson shook his head. You're a good man, Caleb. You see the world the way it should be. But the world the way it is, that's different. Caleb turned back to face him. During the war, I saw men fight impossible battles. I saw them stand against overwhelming odds because surrendering meant betraying everything they believed in. He moved back to the table, placing his hand over the letter. You spent 34 years protecting this truth. Don't give up on it now. Jackson looked at him for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his watch. He held it up, the lamplight catching its tarnished surface. 3:47, Jackson said. The moment Garrett died, the moment my old life ended, and this half-life began. I've carried this watch every day, wound it every day, as a reminder of what I did, and what it cost me. And now? Now I'm tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being a ghost. Jackson set the watch on the table beside the letter. If Clayton Merrick wants to bring me to trial, then let him. But this time, the truth comes out, all of it. Even if it costs me my life, At least I'll die with my name cleared. At least Elizabeth might learn that her father wasn't a coward or a murderer, that he loved her, that he protected her the only way he knew how. Caleb felt something shift in his chest, a determination that went beyond protecting an innocent man. This was about justice, about truth, about standing against the kind of corruption that let powerful men destroy lives without consequence. "Merrick is coming at dawn," Caleb said. "We have maybe 6 hours. What are you thinking?" Caleb pulled out his own pocket watch, a simple brass timepiece that had belonged to his father. Unlike Jackson's frozen watch, this one still ticked steadily forward. Time that hadn't stopped, life that continued to move. "I'm thinking we don't wait for Merrick to come to us." He looked at Jackson with new resolve. "I'm thinking we go to him. We take this letter, these documents, and we force a reckoning. But we do it in town, in front of witnesses, where he can't simply make us disappear. That's dangerous. Staying here is dangerous. At least in town we have a chance of the truth being heard." Jackson studied him, then slowly nodded. "I can't make the journey down the mountain. Not anymore. My body won't survive it. Then I'll go. I'll take the letter to the territorial marshal. I'll make sure this gets into the right hands." Caleb began gathering supplies. "But first, I need to make a copy. We can't risk the original being lost or destroyed." He spent the next hour carefully transcribing Garrett's letter, word for word, his handwriting neat and precise. When he finished, he had 2 copies. One that matched the original as closely as possible, and another simplified version that captured the essential confession. Jackson watched him work, something like hope beginning to kindle in his eyes. "You really think this will work?" "I think it's the only chance we have." Caleb folded the copies carefully and placed them in separate pockets. The original he returned to Jackson. "Keep this safe. If something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you." "If something happens," Caleb insisted, "you show this to whoever comes. Make them read it. Make them understand." Outside, the snow had stopped, and the eastern sky was beginning to lighten. Dawn was coming, and with it, Mayor Clayton Merrick and his armed men. But this time, Caleb would be ready. This time, the truth would have a voice. He checked his rifle, loaded his revolver, and prepared for what might be the most important confrontation of his life. Not a battle fought with bullets alone, but a battle for justice, for truth, for the vindication of a man who'd suffered in silence for more than 3 decades. The sun rose slowly, painting the snow gold and pink, beautiful and deceptive, like so many things in this world that seemed simple on the surface but hid deep currents of pain beneath. Caleb stood on the porch, watching the trail, waiting, and in the cabin behind him, Jackson Ward wound his watch one more time, counting the turns, honoring the moment when everything had changed. But this time, perhaps time wouldn't stay frozen. Perhaps it would finally move forward, carrying truth in its wake. Deputy Crawford stepped between Caleb and Merrick, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to diffusing dangerous situations. "Everyone lower your weapons. Now." Caleb lowered his rifle slightly, but didn't relax his arc or grip. Merrick's hand moved away from his revolver, though the rage in his eyes remained. "Mayor Merrick," Crawford continued, "I understand your family's reputation is at stake. But if there's evidence that changes the nature of this case, I have a legal obligation to investigate. That's not negotiable." "Your obligation," Merrick said through clenched teeth, "is to arrest a wanted fugitive. Everything else is distraction." "Is it?" Crawford turned to look at the hired guns. "Mr. Hayes," he addressed the older gunman, "you served in the war, didn't you? 3rd Colorado Cavalry?" The older gunman, Hayes, nodded slowly. "I did, sir." "Then you understand duty. Understand the difference between following orders and doing what's right." Crawford gestured to Caleb. "This man is wearing a valor medal from that same regiment. He's risking everything to defend someone he believes is innocent. Doesn't that count for something?" Hayes shifted in his saddle, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm just hired for security, Deputy. I don't get involved in politics." "This isn't politics," Caleb said, his voice carrying across the snowy clearing. "This is about whether we let powerful men bury the truth because it's convenient, about whether justice means anything beyond what money can buy." "Justice?" Merrick laughed bitterly. "You want to talk about justice? Jackson Ward killed a man, shot him in his own home, fled like a coward. That's not justice. That's murder." "Samuel Garrett sent men to burn down Ward's home with him inside," Caleb countered. "Planned to kill him or frame him for a crime he didn't commit. All to steal land that wasn't his. That's not business. That's conspiracy to commit murder." "Alleged conspiracy," Merrick corrected, "based on a letter you claim exists but haven't produced." Jackson stepped forward, moving carefully but with dignity. From inside his shirt, he pulled out the leather journal. His hands shook as he opened it, found the hidden pocket, and withdrew the original letter. "This is Samuel Garrett's letter," Jackson said, holding it up. The blood-stained edge was visible even from several feet away. "Written the day before he died. The blood on this paper is his. I took it from his desk after he drew a weapon on me. After we fought. After he died." He looked directly at Merrick. "Your father knew about this letter. Knew what Garrett had planned. He was part of it. And when Garrett died, he used that death to complete what they'd started, stealing my land and building his fortune on my family's suffering." "That's slander," Merrick hissed. "My father was a respected businessman. He acquired property legally, through proper channels." "Through forged documents," Caleb interrupted. "Through a signature that doesn't match Ward's handwriting. Through intimidation and fear." Deputy Crawford held out his hand. "Mr. Ward, I need to see that letter." Jackson hesitated, looking at Caleb. In that moment, Caleb saw the fear in the old man's eyes, the fear of handing over the only proof he had, the only thing that stood between him and a rope. "It's all right," Caleb said quietly. "The deputy is an honest man. You can trust him." Jackson slowly extended the letter toward Crawford. As he did, Merrick moved with sudden violence, lunging forward to snatch the paper from Jackson's trembling hand. But Caleb was faster. He stepped between them, his rifle coming up, the barrel inches from Merrick's chest. "Don't," Caleb said, his voice deadly calm. Merrick froze, his eyes wild. "You wouldn't dare, not with a deputy marshal watching." "Try me." The hired guns drew their weapons in one smooth motion, 4 rifles and 2 revolvers aimed at Caleb, who stood his ground, his own rifle steady on Merrick's chest. "Lower your weapons," Crawford shouted, his own revolver drawn now. "All of you, this stops now." "They're threatening a territorial officer," one of the hired guns said uncertainly. "I'm threatening a man trying to destroy evidence," Caleb corrected. "That's a crime, even for a mayor." Hayes, the older gunman, slowly lowered his rifle. "Deputy's right. This has gone far enough." He looked at his fellow hired guns. "I didn't sign on to help cover up murder and theft. If that letter says what they claim, we're on the wrong side." "You're fired," Merrick snapped. "That's fine by me." Hayes holstered his weapon and turned his horse. "Good luck, gentlemen. You're going to need it." He rode away, and after a moment's hesitation, 2 of the other hired guns followed. That left one man, young, nervous, his rifle shaking in his hands. "Son," Crawford said gently, "put the weapon down. This isn't your fight." The young gunman looked at Merrick, then at the deputy, then at Caleb's unwavering stance. Finally, he lowered his rifle. "Smart choice," Crawford said. He turned to Merrick. "Mayor, step back, now." Merrick's face was purple with rage and fear. "This is outrageous. I'm a duly elected official. I demand—" "You demand nothing." Crawford's voice was ice. "You just attempted to destroy evidence in a murder investigation. That makes you subject to arrest." "On what grounds? The word of a fugitive?" "On the grounds that I witnessed you try to take evidence by force." Crawford gestured to Jackson. "Mr. Ward, the letter, please." Jackson handed it over, his relief palpable. Crawford read it carefully, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he looked at Merrick with something like disgust. "This is specific, detailed. It describes a plan to commit murder and theft." He turned to Jackson. "Mr. Ward, I'm not arresting you. Not yet. But you will need to come to the territorial capital to give a full statement. We'll need to investigate these claims thoroughly." "I understand," Jackson said quietly. "And you, Mayor Merrick?" Crawford fixed him with a hard stare. "You're under investigation for obstruction of justice and possible conspiracy after the fact. I suggest you hire a lawyer, a good one." Merrick stood there, his entire world crumbling around him, and for the first time since he'd arrived at the cabin, he looked uncertain, afraid. "This isn't over," he said, but the threat rang hollow now. "No," Crawford agreed, "it's not. But it will be. One way or another, the truth will come out." As Merrick remounted his horse and rode away, flanked by his last remaining hired gun, Caleb finally lowered his rifle. His hands were shaking with released tension. Jackson sagged against the porch railing, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. Caleb moved to support him. "Is it really over?" Jackson whispered. "Not yet," Caleb said. "But we're closer than we've been in 34 years." Deputy Crawford carefully folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. "I'll need both of you to come down to Redemption Falls. Give full statements. This journal, too. It's evidence." "Can we wait a few days?" Caleb asked. "Jackson needs rest. The journey down will be hard on him." Crawford considered, then nodded. 3 days. Then I'll come back with a wagon to transport him safely. In the meantime..." He pulled out a document and signed it. "This is a temporary stay on the arrest warrant. Jackson Ward is in my custody, released on his own recognizance, pending investigation." He handed the document to Jackson, who took it with trembling hands. "Thank you," Jackson said, his voice breaking. "Don't thank me yet. If the investigation shows you murdered Garrett in cold blood, warrant or not, you'll stand trial." Crawford's expression softened slightly. "But if what you've told me is true, then a grave injustice has been done, and I intend to see it made right." He mounted his horse and tipped his hat. 3 days, gentlemen. Be ready." As Crawford rode away, Caleb and Jackson stood together on the porch, watching the sun climb higher in the clear morning sky. The storm had passed. The air was crisp and clean, and for the first time in more than 3 decades, Jackson Ward could breathe freely, knowing the truth was finally being heard. Spring came early to the high country that year, as if the world itself was ready for renewal. The snow melted in rushing streams, the meadows turned green, and wildflowers pushed through the earth with stubborn optimism. Caleb stood at the cabin window, watching the morning light paint the peaks gold. Behind him, Jackson sat in his rocking chair, but he wasn't alone. Beside him, in the chair Caleb had built for visitors, sat a woman perhaps in her early 40s, with graying dark hair and eyes that held both sorrow and joy in equal measure. Elizabeth Ward Morrison had traveled from St. Louis when the newspapers broke the story. "Local hero exonerated after 34 years, the headline had read. Mayor's family built fortune on theft and murder. The territorial investigation had been thorough. Deputy Crawford had proven to be a man of his word. He'd verified the handwriting on Garrett's letter against known samples, confirmed the forgery on the property transfer, and tracked down surviving witnesses who'd been too afraid to speak in 1851, but were willing to testify now. The evidence had been overwhelming. Jackson Ward had acted in self-defense. Samuel Garrett and Clayton Merrick Sr. had conspired to steal his land through intimidation, arson, and planned murder. The official record had been built on lies. Clayton Merrick Jr. had been stripped of his position as mayor, his properties seized pending restitution to the Ward family estate. He was awaiting trial on charges of obstruction of justice. The family name, so carefully cultivated over 3 decades, lay in ruins. But none of that mattered as much as what was happening in this cabin right now. "I thought you were dead," Elizabeth said, for perhaps the 10th time since arriving 3 days ago. "Mama told me you'd gone away to protect us, that you loved us. But I thought she was just trying to make me feel better about you abandoning us." Jackson's hands trembled as he reached for hers. "I wanted to come back. Every day for 34 years I wanted to come back. But I couldn't, not without putting you in danger. I know that now." She squeezed his weathered hand gently. "I read your journal, all of it. Every word you wrote about Mama, about me, about trying to build something good for us. I understand why you did what you did." Caleb quietly moved toward the door, giving them privacy, but Elizabeth called out to him. "Mr. Stone, Caleb, please don't go. You're part of this story, too." He turned back. Elizabeth stood and crossed to him, and before he could protest, she embraced him. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for caring for him when he had no one. Thank you for believing him when the whole world said he was guilty. Thank you for fighting for the truth." Caleb awkwardly patted her shoulder. "I just did what anyone would do." "No," Jackson said from his chair. "You did what you chose to do. What a good man chooses to do. There's a difference." Elizabeth returned to her father's side, and Caleb watched them together. This family reunited after more than 3 decades of separation and pain. Jackson's hands no longer shook quite so much. His mind seemed clearer, as if the burden of guilt and fear he'd carried for so long had been weighing him down physically as well as emotionally. "What will you do now?" Caleb asked. Elizabeth smiled. "Papa is coming to live with me and my family in St. Louis. My husband is a doctor. He can make sure Papa gets proper care. And our children," her voice caught, "our children will finally get to know their grandfather." "Grandchildren?" Jackson murmured, wonder in his voice. "I have grandchildren. 3 of them," Elizabeth confirmed. 2 boys and a girl. The girl is named Mary, after Mama. I'd like to name the next one Jackson, if you approve." Tears ran down Jackson's weathered face, but he was smiling. "I'd like that very much." They talked through the morning, sharing stories, filling in the gaps of 34 years. Elizabeth told her father about her life, her marriage, her children, the bakery she and her husband owned. Jackson listened with hungry attention, memorizing every detail as if afraid it might slip away. Around noon, Mrs. Chen arrived in a wagon driven by a young man Elizabeth had hired in Redemption Falls. She'd brought food, a feast, really, and her presence brought a different kind of warmth to the cabin. "I had to see for myself," Mrs. Chen said, embracing Jackson carefully. "Had to see that you were really free, really vindicated." "Thanks to you," Jackson said. If you hadn't told Caleb about Mary's letter, about what really happened, I should have spoken up 34 years ago," Mrs. Chen interrupted gently. "Should have been braver. But at least I can be brave now." They ate together, the four of them, sharing food and stories and the kind of companionship that comes from surviving hardship together. Caleb found himself content just to listen, to watch Jackson's face light up as he talked with his daughter, to see the old man finally at peace. Later, as the sun began its descent, Elizabeth prepared to leave. The journey to St. Louis would take weeks, and Jackson needed time to prepare for the travel. They would leave in a month, when the mountain passes were fully clear and the weather stable. Before she climbed into the wagon, Elizabeth turned to Caleb one more time. "The territorial government is returning Papa's land to our family, the original homestead, with the spring." She smiled. "I have no use for it. My life is in St. Louis. But it seems wrong to sell it to strangers after everything it cost us. Would you—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Would you consider staying here, managing the land? It would give Papa peace of mind to know someone he trusts is caring for the place that meant so much to him." Caleb looked at the mountains, at the cabin he'd built with his own hands, at the land he'd come to love. "I'd be honored," he said simply. After Elizabeth and Mrs. Chen departed, Caleb and Jackson sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. The old man held his pocket watch in his hands, but for the first time since Caleb had known him, he wasn't winding it. "I think," Jackson said slowly, "it's time to let this go." He held up the watch, frozen forever at 3:47. "That moment, that night, it's over. I don't need to carry it anymore." "What will you do with it?" Jackson smiled. "I think I'll give it to my grandson. Tell him the story of why it stopped and why I finally let it rest. Maybe he'll learn something about justice, about truth, about standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness gathered. In the cabin behind them, the journal lay open on the table, its pages recording a story that had finally found its proper ending. Beside it sat the wooden doll that had waited 34 years for Elizabeth to return, and the photograph of a family that had survived despite everything trying to tear them apart. Some debts could never be repaid, Caleb thought, but some could be honored. Some could be remembered, and some could finally, mercifully, be set down. Jackson dozed in his chair as the stars emerged, one by one in the darkening sky. His breathing was steady and peaceful, the kind of sleep that comes when the weight of the world has finally been lifted from your shoulders. Caleb pulled a blanket over the old man and stood looking out at the mountains. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities. But tonight, there was just this: peace, justice, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing he'd done the right thing. In the distance, an owl called. The wind whispered through the pines. And high in the Colorado Rockies, where the air was thin and the silence profound, two men who'd found each other in the wilderness rested easy, knowing the truth had finally set them free. The mountains stood eternal and indifferent, witnesses to all the small human dramas played out in their shadow. But if mountains could feel, perhaps they felt something like approval. For once, justice had prevailed. For once, the powerful had not won simply by virtue of their power. For once, an old man who'd spent 34 years in exile could go home again. Not as a fugitive, but as a father, a grandfather, and a man whose name had finally been cleared. And that, Caleb thought as he settled into his own chair beside Jackson's, was worth every risk, every sacrifice, every moment of uncertainty. Some fights were worth having. Some truths were worth defending, and some old soldiers, whether from war or from life itself, never really lost their edge. They just needed the right cause to fight for.